The US has imposed sanctions on dozens of countries. It's hard to give a precise number because the situation is always changing, and the sanctions can vary widely, but it's estimated that roughly 1/3 of the world's population is living in a country that is currently fully or partially sanctioned by the United States. The United States by far applies sanctions more frequently than any other country or nation, more than double that of the second most prolific sanctioning country. And under President Joe Biden's administration, the country has reached new heights in the number of sanctions imposed. In 2023 alone, the Biden administration added 2,500 sanctions. This marked a 10% increase from the previous year, and the sanctions have primarily targeted Russia, as well as entities in China and the Middle East. Economic sanctions are a tool used by countries like the United States to influence or control the actions of foreign nations, organizations, or individuals. These measures are often used to address a range of geopolitical issues, from human rights abuses to corruption to nuclear proliferation and aggression. Economic sanctions can take various forms, but the most common include trade barriers that restrict the import or export of goods to and from a targeted nation, tariffs that increase the cost of these goods to reduce their competitiveness, or financial restrictions that limit a country's access to international markets and capital. For example, when Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, the United States, along with many other Western countries, responded by imposing a series of economic sanctions on Russia. These sanctions are extensive and cover various sectors. They include blocking the assets of Russian government officials and business leaders linked to the government, also restricting trades in key sectors like defense, energy, and financial services, and limiting access to international banking systems like SWIFT. These sanctions were designed to hit the Russian economy hard, particularly its ability to produce and export oil and gas, which are major sources of revenue for the country. The rationale is that by cutting off access to vital economic resources and capital, the United States can pressure foreign nations and entities to change their behavior in ways that align with the goals of U.S. foreign policy, or can even lead to regime change. But the problem is that usually sanctions don't work as intended, and actually they cause a lot of damage to our own economy. Unfortunately, this is a topic that is rarely discussed in America and Western mainstream media, but it's crucial for Americans to understand how our aggressive foreign policies can have serious negative impacts on our economy. And in this video, I will explain how by sanctioning countries so prolifically, the United States is actually destroying its own economy, and all of this will backfire dramatically. As an example of how ineffective sanctions are, let's consider the impact of U.S. sanctions on several countries, starting with Cuba. Since the early 1960s, following the Cuban Revolution and Fidel Castro's rise to power, Cuba has been subjected to extensive economic sanctions by the United States. These sanctions were initially imposed with the aim of overthrowing Castro's government after the nationalization of properties owned by U.S. citizens and corporations. Despite causing severe economic hardships, these sanctions have not succeeded in changing the regime. Instead, the Cuban government has tightened its hold on power, bolstered by nationalistic rhetoric, control over the economy, and the media. North Korea presents another stark example of a regime's endurance under American sanctions. This country has been under various forms of international and unilateral U.S. sanctions for decades, primarily due to its nuclear ambitions and human rights records. But rather than capitulating to international pressure, the North Korean regime has continued its nuclear development and maintained strict control over its population. The government has effectively used sanctions as a tool to fuel domestic propaganda that portrays the regime as a protector against hostile external forces such as the United States and the West. And another more recent example of a nation adapting to sanctions is Russia, the most sanctioned country in the world, which has managed not only to survive, but also grow its economy under U.S. sanctions. In response to sanctions, Russia has heavily invested in domestic industries to reduce its reliance on imports. This strategy, often termed import substitution, aims to bolster domestic manufacturing capabilities in critical sectors like technology and agriculture. Building on these moves, Russia has really ramped up its relationship with China, making strong connections in their economies and militaries. By teaming up with China, Russia now has a key place to sell its energy and work together on technology projects, especially in areas where Western sanctions have caused problems. All of these strategies help Russia keep its economy strong and connect with other powerful nations to soften the blow from any Western sanctions. The Russian government also used sanctions as a tool to strengthen President Vladimir Putin's domestic standing. By framing the sanctions as a direct attack by the West against Russia, the Kremlin has successfully rallied nationalistic sentiments among the Russian population. So basically, the resilience of sanctioned countries like Cuba, North Korea, and Russia just demonstrates the limitations of sanctions as a tool for regime change. While these measures can attempt to isolate a country economically and diplomatically, their success in causing real change in government or policy is extremely rare and limited. Sanctions are not only ineffective at achieving their intended political goals, but they can also carry significant unintended consequences that can severely impact the economies of both the United States and its allies. A good example is how U.S. sanctions on Russia have affected global energy markets and the economic stability of European allies. For example, by imposing sanctions on Russia, this has led to major disruptions in the global energy supply, particularly affecting Europe. Russia has historically been one of the largest suppliers of natural gas and oil to Europe. When these supplies were cut due to sanctions, it led to a dramatic increase in energy prices across the continent. For example, European gas prices surged by over 180% in the first 2 weeks after the invasion of Ukraine. This dramatic increase was driven by fears of supply disruptions and the immediate impact of sanctions on Russian energy exports. Even though prices have somewhat moderated since then, they remain significantly higher than pre-conflict levels. And due to these high energy prices, many companies are now considering relocating their operations. According to a survey by the German Industry Federation, high energy prices are driving some companies to move their production abroad. The German Chamber of Commerce and Industry found that 40% of industrial companies are contemplating reducing or relocating their production outside Germany due to the energy situation. Among companies with more than 500 employees, over half are now considering this option.
The head of Volkswagen's Workers' Council says the car giant intends to close at least 3 factories in Germany, leading to the loss of tens of thousands of jobs. Volkswagen has never closed a plant in Germany before. The announcement comes after VW reported a 14% drop in net profits in the first half of the year and ended a decades-old agreement with unions.
In addition to hurting our allies abroad, sanctions are also proving costly to our own economy here in the United States. Like I already mentioned, one of the most immediate effects of the sanctions imposed on Russia, one of the world's largest producers of oil and natural gas, was the disruption of global energy markets. These sanctions effectively reduced the amount of Russian oil and gas available on the global market, contributing to increased energy prices worldwide. For the US, this meant higher gasoline prices for consumers and increased operation costs for businesses reliant on fuel and energy. For example, United States gas prices saw an increase of about 40% from their pre-sanction levels, significantly impacting consumer spending power and contributing to inflation. And even though gas prices have decreased from their peak in 2022, it remains above the levels observed before the sanctions were intensified. Sanctions affect not only energy but also raw materials and other goods that the United States imports from Russia. These include metals like aluminum and palladium, essential for automotive technology industries. The United States automotive industry has especially felt the impact of the sanctions and the ongoing conflict. These events have thrown a wrench into supply chains, causing significant production delays and ramping up costs. For instance, in 2022, these disruptions led to a cutback of about 400,000 units in global auto production. And usually countries respond by sanctioning us as well, or using retaliatory measures that have a direct impact on various U.S. industries. For example, when the United States imposed tariffs on Chinese goods in 2018, China in response imposed retaliatory tariffs on a range of American products, including soybeans. China was the largest market for U.S. soybean exports, and the tariffs led to a sharp decline in exports, causing soybean prices to fall and leading to financial distress for American farmers. And by 2018, U.S. soybean exports to China fell by 76%, from 12.3 billion to 3.1 billion. As a result of the tariffs, China just turned to Brazil to meet its soybean demand. Brazil, the largest soybean exported to China, saw a 40% increase in soybean exports to China compared to the previous year. This shift further reduced the market share for U.S. soybeans. And this gets me to my next point, and that is that by constantly sanctioning countries like Russia, China, and many other countries, countries around the world are starting to separate from the U.S.-controlled global economy. Several countries around the world see that when a country does something that the United States doesn't like, the U.S. responds by imposing sanctions and weaponizing the dollar against these countries. As a result, this has pushed these countries to create their own system for trade or finance and technology. For example, they are now using their own currencies more often in trade to avoid relying on the U.S. dollar, which has been the world's main currency and a key part of U.S. power. This change could weaken the dollar's dominance and hurt the United States financial system's position in the world. Russia and China are not the only countries that are moving away from American dependence. Saudi Arabia expressed its openness to trading in currencies other than the US dollar for the first time in 48 years during an interview at the 2023 World Economic Forum at Davos. The Saudi Finance Minister Mohammed Al-Jadaan mentioned that the kingdom is now open to discussing trade arrangements in currencies like the euro or the Saudi riyal. This move is a part of a broader strategy to reduce reliance on the US dollar and explore alternative trade currencies. The United Arab Emirates and India are also in talks to use the rupee for trading non-oil commodities, moving away from the US dollar. On July 15, 2023, during a visit to Abu Dhabi, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi signed agreements to use national currencies for trade settlements and to create a real-time link for cross-border transactions. This trend of moving away from US-centric economic systems brings us to the growing influence of the BRICS nations. The expansion of BRICS is a significant indicator of how countries are banding together to resist American economic dominance. Originally formed as an association of 5 major emerging national economies, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, BRICS has now evolved into a platform that challenges the traditional Western-centric financial and trade frameworks. This group of countries has been working on strengthening economic cooperation, including the development of a new joint payment network that reduces dependency on Western financial systems, such as SWIFT, which has been used to enforce sanctions. The potential of BRICS really stands out because of their combined economic power. Together, these countries make up a huge chunk of the world's population and have a wealth of different natural resources. For example, BRICS countries account for approximately 45% of the world's population, which is about 3.5 billion people. In terms of GDP, BRICS nations make up around 35% of the global economy, which is about $28.5 trillion. In October 2024, BRICS held an important summit in Kazan, Russia, where they outlined their upcoming plans. At the summit, the BRICS countries highlighted how important it is for them to depend less on the United States dollar. They talked about setting up new payment systems that could work around the SWIFT network, which the U.S. heavily influences. This plan would allow BRICS nations and their trading partners to carry out transactions without relying on the US dollar or Western financial systems. Also during the BRICS summit, 13 new partner countries were added to the BRICS alliance. These countries aren't full members yet, but bringing them in as partners is a strategic way for BRICS to strengthen economic and political connections among rising economies. This move shows how BRICS is becoming more influential and is dedicated to shaping a world where power is spread out more evenly and not just concentrated in the United States or the West. And watch how Columbia University professor and economist Jeffrey Sachs explains how meaningful and impactful this BRICS summit is.
This was a meeting of 36 governments. 10 are core BRICS members right now, and the other 26 are BRICS aspirants. They want to join the BRICS. The roundtable discussion among the leaders of these 36 countries encompassed 57% of the world population and nearly half of the world output measured in international prices. In other words, this was a very, very significant meeting representing more than half of the world. What these countries were saying was they don't like the United States and its so-called friends and allies operating outside of the UN system, overthrowing governments, putting on sanctions that are not legal by international standards, bullying countries, and so forth.
So this is a big deal. If these countries start to move away from the US dollar, this will have devastating effects on our economy. But again, the mainstream media and our leaders rarely talk about this because they don't want to admit that our actions have serious negative consequences. As more countries find viable alternatives to the US dollar and Western financial systems, the influence of the United States in global economic affairs could diminish in several ways. The US dollar has long been the world's primary reserve currency, meaning it is widely held by governments and institutions as part of their foreign exchange reserves. This dominance gives the United States significant economic leverage. When other countries conduct international trade in dollars, it creates a steady demand for the currency, reinforcing its strength and stability. This demand allows the US to borrow money at lower interest rates, maintain lower inflation, and sustain a higher standard of living. This also enables the US to influence global economic policies through financial mechanisms like sanctions, for example, or international loans through institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, where the US has substantial voting power. A reduced global demand for the dollar would undermine these mechanisms. If countries increasingly use other currencies or establish alternative financial systems, the US dollar's value and influence would diminish. And this would significantly impact everyday Americans because when the dollar weakens, it means that it takes more dollars to buy the same amount of foreign currency. This directly impacts the cost of importing goods because American businesses and consumers must spend more dollars to purchase products from abroad. For example, if the dollar weakens against the euro, goods imported from Europe, such as cars, electronics, and fashion items, become more expensive. This cost is typically passed on to consumers, resulting in higher prices at checkout. Given that the US imports a substantial amount of consumer goods, including everyday items like clothing, electronics, food, and the overall cost of living can increase. This inflation reduces the purchasing power of American households, meaning they can buy less with the same amount of money. Over time, this erodes the standard of living as more income is spent on necessities, leaving less for savings and discretionary spending. So basically, as the United States continues to sanction and punish countries like Russia and China and others, these countries will just start seeking alternatives to the US dollar. This will weaken the dollar, and this shift will trigger inflation and market instability in the United States, driving up prices for everyday items and overall hurting the American economy. Anyways, guys, thank you so much for watching this video. This is, in my opinion, a real important topic that is not discussed much in the media. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Leave a like to promote this to other people to watch this video. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to watch this one or this one, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care, guys. Bye-bye.